Broadcasting from the world headquarters of the National Floor Safety Institute is America's slip and fall guy, Russ Kenzie.
This is America's slip and fall guy, Russ Kenzior. Thanks for listening to my podcast. Oftentimes when I'm retained as an expert witness, I have to render opinions based on the standard of care. Did the defendant violate the standard of care, or did the plaintiff act unreasonably as to cause or contribute to their own slip and fall or trip and fall event? And so the question is, what establishes or what is the standard of care? Well, the standard of care is based on many different aspects, certainly including standards, industry standards, but also things like laws and codes, building codes, safety codes, or best practices. It can be confusing. So let's try to separate it out. The first and most important establishment of the standard of care is based on laws. Laws like OSHA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. Those are the two most common laws that affect the standard of care as it relates to a slip and fall or a trip and fall lawsuit. Well, OSHA has a rule. It's a Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR 1910.22, entitled Walking and Working Surfaces, that relates to slips and falls. Sadly, there's not a lot in that code specifically that can be relied upon because it really just references or focuses on maintenance, housekeeping, cleanliness. There is no OSHA requirement for measuring slip resistance, for example, of a floor. OSHA doesn't require any specific coefficient of friction testing to be performed on walkways, and again, only applies to workers in the workplace. Although there are many people who will claim that there are requirements by OSHA as it relates to floor safety, well, the fact is there aren't any, and there never has been any. The same is true for the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. And within the ADA, again, they require that means of egress, meaning pathways by which are to accommodate those with disabilities, have certain or meet certain conditions. For example, the ADA requires that changes in elevation greater than 1/4 of an inch have to be sloped or ramped, oftentimes tapered in such a way to be compliant. They also require that walkways or means of egress, is the terminology they use, be stable, firm, and slip resistant. However, they don't define the term slip resistant. And so if you're a defendant and you have to defend yourself in that you were in compliance with the ADA's requirement for slip resistance or slip resistant, two different terms, that you, in fact, were taking measurements. You were doing something to actually create data or take a measurement of the coefficient of friction as to suggest that you were, in fact, providing a slip-resistant surface. But again, it's an ambiguous term. Building codes, like the International Building Code, as published by the International Code Council, and the NFPA, the National Fire Protection Codes, it's actually the NFPA 101 Life Safety Code, also reference a requirement for walkways not to have a change in elevation greater than 1/4 of an inch. And if they do, they have to be sloped or ramped in some way, tapered, as to accommodate individuals with disabilities. Both the International Building Code, the ICC, and the NFPA have sections within the codes that speak to means of egress and also really just kind of mirror what the ADA has to say. Or if you're here in the state of Texas, as I am, we have a organization known as the Texas Accessibility Standard, TAS, which basically are provisions that are required through the state of Texas as it relates to building, constructing commercial premises to accommodate those with disabilities. And so we have laws like OSHA and ADA that really don't have a lot of specific information or requirements as relates to walkway safety. There are no standards that are cited within either the OSHA or ADA codes, guidelines, whatever you want to call them. They're federal laws. They're mandated by law. And so there's not a lot in there that property owners really need to be concerned about as it relates to measuring coefficient of friction. The only real references are, again, dealing with changes in elevation. Both the ICC and the NFPA kind of mirror those requirements, and so there's not a lot there other than changes in elevation. And so then we go on to look at what are the industry standards, or what are oftentimes referred to as voluntary consensus standards. And there's two, I would say 2.5 groups. The first is ANSI, American National Standards Institute. The second is the American Society of Testing and Materials, now known as ASTM International. And the third one I mentioned is kind of a half, is the National Floor Safety Institute, the NFSI. And the reason I refer to it as a half is because the NFSI is an ANSI standards developer. And so the NFSI B101 Committee on Slip, Trip, and Fall Prevention ultimately publishes the standards that get published as ANSI/NFSI B101 standards. But the NFSI also publishes its own private standards. And so every time the B101 committee completes their work, it will be automatically published. The standard will be automatically published as an NFSI B101 standard. The process by which that standard propagates as an ANSI standard can be timely. It can take up to several years. And so you will oftentimes find ANSI NFSI standards as well as just NFSI standards. Both have the same level of weight or credibility. ANSI and ASTM are two private organizations that have been around for over 100 years, and they propagate standards in a little bit different ways. ANSI actually seeks out organizations, trade associations, or in the case of NFSI, a safety organization, to publish standards under the ANSI banner, while the ASTM actually has its own committees that propagate standards. So within the ASTM, you'll see a wide range of committees. For example, the most widely known is the ASTM F13 or F13 standard on traction and footwear. That committee publishes a wide range of standards, most of which have to do with safety guidelines, slip, trip, and fall prevention guidelines. They've been around for many, many years. The most common standard published through the ASTM, and again, it's a voluntary standard, is the ASTM F1637 standard on walkway surface safety. It's a standard that I rely upon quite often. It's really a very good standard. It's very clear and concise. It talks about the use of floor mats, the requirement that walkways must remain dry under normal conditions, that a wet floor constitutes, if you will, a slip hazard. And there's other provisions within the standard that talks about wheel stops and other things that are specifically related to changes in elevations. The ASTM F1677 standard was widely used back, probably 20 years ago. And that was a kind of a user's manual for how to take measurements of what was known as slip index using a portable, inclinable, articulated strut tester, otherwise known as a PIAST. It, along with the ASTM F1679 standard, were withdrawn in 2006. The 1679 standard called for how to use and operate a variable incident tribometer, or VIT. The only PIAST device that, to my knowledge, has ever been manufactured and used is called the Brungraber Mark II device. I believe there's now a Brungraber Mark III device on the marketplace, not very popular, but nonetheless being manufactured. And the only VIT, or variable incident tribometer, to my knowledge, that's been manufactured and used was a device commonly known as the English XL. Both the PIST and the VIT tribometers have fallen out of favor with the recent introduction of robotic testers. And as I mentioned, in 2006, both the ASTM F1677 and 1679 standards were withdrawn and therefore are no longer recognized as applicable standards. Neither of those two standards, although were designed to measure slip resistance or slip index, actually had any real marketability or usability. They were primarily used by either insurance companies or individuals representing themselves as expert witnesses in many cases. And again, those two standards are gone. There was also a standard published by the ASTM F13 committee. It's still an active standard called ASTM F2913 or 2913. It's a footwear slip resistance testing method whereby you can actually measure how slippery the outsole of a shoe is. But again, it just generates a value, a number, and the user of that standard really has no basis to establish whether or not a particular shoe sole was slip resistant or not. It may be surprising for you to know that when a manufacturer labels the shoes that they manufacture or produce as slip resistant, there really isn't any basis for establishing what constitutes a slip-resistant sole. The term slip-resistant is really used more as an adjective to describe an inherent benefit of a particular shoe without any real serious or published scientific evidence to substantiate that the degree of slip resistance as measured per the ASTM 2913 standard really has any credibility. Now, that being said, the National Floor Safety Institute is working towards and will soon be publishing a standard entitled NFSI B101.7, and it's a footwear outsole test method that specifically will break down the level of slip resistance into three categories. Shoes will either be ranked as high traction, moderate traction, or low traction. And that process is also duplicated in the NFSI B101.1 and B101.3 coefficient of friction test methods that have been published since 2009 and 2012. And we have found that approach of breaking down slip resistance into three different levels, high traction, moderate traction, and low traction, provides much better guidance and understanding of safety and the safety aspects of both floors as well as footwear. The ASTM F15 committee, 1.5, had published a standard which was used for decades entitled ASTM F462. And it was a bathtub safety standard that actually permitted or cited the use of a specific device known as a Brungraber Mark I tribometer, which has been manufactured for probably 20, 25 years. The ASTM F462 standard has been withdrawn, and there is currently a move to try to revise it, to bring it back, if you will, kind of a ASTM F462 plus approach, but it's uncertain as to the future of that standard. So as it stands today, there is no published standard by the ASTM or ANSI for bathtubs. There is a standard that's being developed by the NFSI entitled NFSI B101.4. And it's a standard that not only would apply to bathtubs and showers, but any area where people are anticipated to walk under wet, barefoot conditions. That particular standard is propagating its way through the B101 main committee and is anticipated to be published sometime later this year. Another ASTM committee is the C21 Committee on Ceramic Tile, and they used to have a standard for measuring the static coefficient of friction of ceramic tiles, but that was withdrawn a number of years ago, and so the ASTM really has no testing methodology or requirements for ceramic tile. That's also true of vinyl, wood, laminate, and really all other types of floor coverings. It may surprise you to know that the floor covering industry has not been particularly interested in developing slip resistance standards for their products, and it's left kind of a void or a vacuum. That being said, there is an ANSI standard that I'm going to be talking about here shortly that does allow for measuring the dynamic coefficient of friction of ceramic tiles. The last ASTM standard I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about is the D21 committee standard on floor polishes and finishes. The ASTM D2047 or 2047 standard has been around for many years, since the 1970s, and it sets out the process by which how to measure dry static coefficient of friction via a particular tribometer or testing device known as a James machine. And so the ASTM D2047 standard calls for and outlines how to go about measuring dry static coefficient of friction with a laboratory device known as a James machine. The James machine was originally developed by a researcher at Underwriter Laboratories, or UL, by the name of Sidney James. Back in the 1940s, his device has been adopted and used by Underwriter Laboratories since that time, and is currently still published under the name UL 410. And again, it's a testing method that applies specifically to floor finishes and polishes. There are some who use the test method for other types of flooring materials, but its primary focus, its primary use is for floor finishes and floor polishes, the types of coatings that go on commercial floors. Under the ANSI guidelines, there's again a wide range of standards. The ANSI NFSI B101 series of walkway safety standards. You also have a second group who publishes standards for ceramic tile, and those are the ANSI A137.1 and ANSI A326.3 standards published through the Tile Council of North America, or TCNA. And those two standards have created a lot of confusion. Many expert witnesses will go out and take measurements of floors either to the A137.1 or A326.3 standards. And it's important to note that neither of those two standards have anything to do with walkway safety. In fact, both of them clearly state that the standards are irrelevant of safety and that they are primarily used or specifically used for quality control purposes. So if an expert witness is taking measurements in the field to either one of those two standards and then try to relate the coefficient of friction, specifically the dynamic coefficient of friction data that they have collected, to that of a level of safety, well, they are incorrect. And I'm saying that because both of the standards, the A137.1 and A326.3 standards, actually have a clearly posted notice of disclaimer that's near the front of the standard. It's in all capitals, it's all capitalized, and it states that the standards are not safety standards and they do not comply with any regulatory requirements. The notice of disclaimer also talks about the fact that there's really no scientific evidence or background to support any of the information within the standard itself. And so it's important to know if you're going to be testing to a particular standard, testing the slip resistance or coefficient of friction, or slip index for that matter, to a particular standard, it's important to note, A, is the standard still published? Is it still relevant? And B, what does the standard apply to? The only standards that are currently published that permit the testing of coefficient of friction, whether it be static or dynamic coefficient of friction, are the ANSI NFSI standards, specifically B101.1 for static friction and B101.3 for dynamic friction. And so if you want to take measurements of a particular walkway or walking surface or floor for the intended purpose of understanding or defining its level of safety, the ANSI NFSI B101 standards are the ones to rely upon. The organization known as the American Society of Safety Professionals, ASSP, formerly known as the ASSE, also has a standard, an ANSI standard that they've been publishing for many years called A1264.2 or A1264.2. And the title of that standard is the provision of slip resistance on walking, working surfaces. And it's a good standard. It's a standard that, again, applies primarily to workers in the workplace. And it outlines a wide range of information, including proper housekeeping procedures, documentation, inspections, policies, etc., as related to identifying and remediating slip or trip hazards. The standard also speaks to warnings, the appropriate ways of providing or posting warnings or barricading areas that are known to present a slip or trip hazards. It also talks about floor matting, the proper use and application of floor mats, and snow removal procedures. The National Floor Safety Institute also is working on a snow removal or inclement weather standard and has published a number of years ago, back in 2012, a standard specifically related to entranceway floor matting. And so there's a little bit of overlap between the ANSI NFSI B101.6 entranceway floor matting standard and that of the ASSP A1264.2 standard. But again, they all harmonize. They are all voluntary. They are not mandated by law. There's no law that says floors have to be safe at all. And so property owners can ignore any of these voluntary standards if they choose to do so, oftentimes at their own demise, which kind of brings this whole discussion to the big picture. And that is, again, what is or what constitutes the standard of care? If a particular property owner wants to ignore these standards, they can do so. Oftentimes, property owners will rely upon what are known as best practices. Best practices come in, again, a wide range or different shapes and sizes, if you will. Best practices are kind of industry specific. They are generated either by trade associations, insurance companies, organizations, for example, like the International Executive Housekeepers Association, or IEHA, will have and develop policies and procedures specifically for their institution, their group of housekeepers. The members of the IEHA will abide by their own best practices. That's also true for other organizations like the American Hotel and Lodging Association, the AHLA. That's an association of hotels in the hospitality industry that creates policies and procedures that they will abide by. Oftentimes, these best practices will reference or are based on the nationally recognized consensus standards like ANSI, NFSI, and ASTM. But oftentimes they're not. They'll just be internal policies or best practices. The insurance industry also will provide supporting documentation or best practices to their policyholders. And so if a particular company, a particular business has their insurance company providing them as a resource information as it relates to walkway safety, slip and fall prevention, trip and fall prevention, oftentimes retailers, for example, national retailers will have internal policies and procedures, training guidelines that they use to train their workers as it relates to walkway safety, including things like how to remediate or clean up a spill, proper procedures for posting warning signs, what types of warning signs to post and when to post them and when to remove them, and then also inspections, how often should they be inspecting their walkways for hazards and what to do if they find one. They'll oftentimes have internal policies on floor mats and everything related to slip, trip, and fall prevention. And so that kind of gives you kind of a basic understanding of policies, procedures, codes, laws, voluntary standards, best practices. But at the end of the day, they're all pretty much the same. The biggest difference between laws and codes and standards and policies and procedures, best practices, etc., is how they're enforced. For example, laws are enforced by law enforcement officials. So if you're driving down the road and you get pulled over by a police officer because they claim you were speeding, they write you a citation, and they are the law enforcement agency, if you will, that enforces laws, and then you, of course, have your opportunity to go in front of a judge and plead your case. But laws are enforced through a law enforcement agency. Codes are very similar. You'll have a code enforcement agency. So if you're building a home or a business, you'll have a code compliance officer, a building inspector, come out and perform inspections of your building as they apply to the building code. Here in Texas, we have a requirement where buildings have to be inspected by a registered accessibility specialist, or RAS. That's a person who's licensed from the state of Texas through the Texas Department of Licensing and Registration, and have complied with the training requirements and ongoing training requirements by the state of Texas to do inspections of facilities as they relates to the Texas Accessibility Standard, the TAS. RAS people, RASs as they are called, and I'm one of them, I'm a RAS, have the responsibility of doing inspections, again, as it relates specifically to the Texas Accessibility Standard, and that oftentimes kind of dovetails with the local building department code inspectors. And so there are, for laws, there are law enforcement officials. For codes, there are code officials that'll come out and ensure that buildings are built within compliance. But again, when it comes to slips, trips, and falls, there's not an awful lot there. There's not a lot that a code enforcement or building inspector can do or is charged to do to ensure that a particular premise is safe as it relates to slips, trips, and falls, which comes down to standards, consensus standards. Although voluntary consensus standards are just that, voluntary, they're not mandated by law, that doesn't mean that they're not important. In fact, they're critically important. And don't let the term voluntary confuse you or kid you. They are voluntary, but they are enforceable as well. They're enforced through the civil court systems. In fact, most, if not all, slips, trips, and falls find themselves in a civil court. It's not a crime. It's not against the law. They have a slippery floor or present a trip hazard. And the enforcement is through the through the civil court system. And so if you're a victim of a slip and fall or in a trip and fall and you believe that a defendant had violated the standard of care, you take them to court. And at the end of the day, there's either violations of the standard of care or there were not. And that's ultimately up to the jury to decide that. And so these industry standards, ASTM, ANSI, NFSI, become very, very important when one is pressing a civil lawsuit. And these standards become very, very important in terms of interpretation. Now, many of these standards and codes and laws have appendices. There's an appendix at the end of the ADA. There are appendices within many standards that are serving an informational role. So oftentimes you'll see the citation of information that's listed in a code or law or standard, and it's not part of the code or law or standard, but rather referenced just for informational purposes, for background information, and they're non-binding. And oftentimes when you're looking at a standard or a code or law, you'll find information that's contained within an appendix, which, although, again, is non-binding, they do provide very good supporting information, and they're not to be disregarded, or ignored. And so what constitutes the standard of care can oftentimes be confusing, can be hard to understand or interpret. And because of that, I'm actually going to be offering a one-day workshop beginning spring, early summer of 2020, entitled What Constitutes the Standard of Care? And the course will be up on the tractionexperts.com website, along with the course schedule and dates that it's going to be offered. The state of Texas has granted the course 8 hours of continuing education credit. So attorneys who are wanting to take that course will actually gain 8 hours of CEU credit. And so if you have any interest in learning more about the standard of care, what are the standards, what constitutes the standard, a violation of the standard of care, that course might be a good course for you. And so with that, this has been America's Slip and Fall Guy, Russ Kenzior, reminding you to don't let your next step be your last step. Until then, take care.